In the last lecture, we had a look at global defaults, global request configuration. In this lecture, I want to dive into interceptors. That's another useful feature Axios supports. Interceptors are functions you can define which should get executed on every request that leaves the app or every response that reaches it. You also do this on the Axios instance itself by accessing the interceptors object there. Then you can choose between request or response, depending on which kind of interceptor you want to create. I'll choose request here. And then you add a new interceptor by using the use method. The use method now takes a function, a normal function or an arrow function, which I will use here. This function receives the request configuration as an argument. And inside this function, you at least have to return this configuration. Otherwise, you will block the request. Now, I will simply log the config here. But of course, and that's the cool thing about an interceptor, you could also manipulate it. You could set config headers and there simply set some global authorization header or something like that. You can do whatever you want here. You can manipulate the request configuration to, for example, step in, check if something is the case, and then on the fly adjust the config for cases where some generic setup, like here, where every request is targeted, might be too generic. So for now, again, I'll just log it. And I will also add another interceptor, again by using the interceptors object and then targeting the response. There we can also register a new interceptor by using the use keyword. And there I will actually get the response as an input. We could use a normal function here too. And there I will also need to return the response. Otherwise, other code in my application which waits for it will never receive it. Keep in mind, interceptors are always just like middleware. They run in between. They should rarely block the response or the request. So here I return the response, and now I simply want to console log the response here too. If we now save this and we go back to the application and reload and go back to the console, you actually see we got more logs here. Now to identify what's coming from where, let me adjust the console logs. Let's say request interceptor here for the first one and still also print the config. And here we got the response interceptor and still print the response. So now with that, let me clear the console and simply reload. And now we see response interceptor here and request interceptor earlier. Now the request interceptor logs the config, and as I said there, you could have stepped in and added or adjusted the headers. Here we see our custom accepts header, which of course deliberately is not the valid normal accept header so that we can see that it was added. Otherwise, this default header would have been added by Axios anyways, so we wouldn't have seen if our header works or not. We see our custom authorization header, and as I said, we could have stepped in and we could have set config headers and then, for example, added something to add our own header. There we don't have to access comment or get or post because we already are on a request level. So this is the request config which we could have edited. We can now also see the response interceptor, which of course holds the exact same response as we later use. And we could have stepped in and transformed the response here too, though of course you should always use all these features with caution to not accidentally break your app. Now these are interceptors, how we can add them. Sometimes you also want to remove them. And to demonstrate this, I will simply instantly remove both. So we actually shouldn't see something logged to the console. So we can remove interceptors by still accessing interceptors, request or response. Here I'll start with request again. And then you can call eject. Eject now needs to get the ID of the interceptor, and that ID is actually returned from the use method. You just have to store it. So I'll create a new constant, request interceptor, where I store the result of that use call, where I set my request interceptor. And then I'll do the same for the response interceptor here. Now I can eject the request interceptor and then duplicate it to do the same for the response interceptor. Now with that, we instantly eject our interceptors, so we actually shouldn't see any effect. We shouldn't see any console logs in our application anymore. If I reload this page, we indeed only see our old console logs and no longer see the console logs from within the interceptor because it's basically ejected right before it ever has a chance to intercept anything. This of course is not that most useful example, but you might have cases where you want to eject them depending on some condition. Well, the eject function is how you can do that.